Officer Tom patrolled the quiet streets of Hillside like he did every day. He took pride in the law, in maintaining order, and in his unshakable sense of right and wrong. His uniform felt like a second skin, and his badge, a constant reminder of his duty to protect and serve, was pinned firmly to his chest. Tom was known in the department for his strict adherence to the rules, a man who saw the world in black and white, with no room for gray areas. As Tom passed the local grocery store, his sharp eyes landed on a sight that set off his well-honed instincts. A young black girl, no older than 9, sat alone on a bench near the store's entrance, quietly nibbling on crackers. There was something about the way she sat there, glancing around nervously, that made Tom suspicious. Kids like that unattended, sitting outside stores, often meant trouble. He slowed his patrol car and parked it across the street, watching her for a few moments longer. Lisa, the little girl, wore her favorite yellow sundress, her dark hair tied back in a neat ponytail. She swung her legs back and forth, waiting patiently for her mother, Edgar, to finish the grocery shopping. In her hands, she clutched a small pack of crackers, a snack her mom had given her to keep her busy. The sun shone warmly on her face, but the moment she saw Officer Tom approaching, a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. Tom strode across the street with purpose, his hand resting on his belt as if ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. His presence cast a shadow over Lisa, and she looked up at him with wide eyes, a mixture of confusion and fear flickering across her young face. "What are you doing here?" young lady, Tom asked, his voice sharp and cold. Lisa blinked, startled by the question. "I'm waiting for my mommy," she said softly, her small voice barely reaching Tom's ears. "She's inside shopping. She gave me these crackers to eat while I wait." Tom's gaze fell on the crackers in her hands. His mind immediately jumped to conclusions, fueled by years of assuming the worst in situations like this. "And where exactly did you get those crackers?" he demanded, suspicion dripping from every word. Lisa's lips quivered, her hands clutching the snack tighter. "My mom gave them to me," she repeated, her voice trembling now. Tom narrowed his eyes, convinced that this little girl had stolen something. The nervousness in her voice, her looking around, it all fit the profile of a kid caught doing something wrong. He felt a sense of duty swelling within him. He couldn't afford to let this go. He was a cop, and this was what cops did: stop crime before it got out of hand. "I think you've been stealing," Tom stated flatly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. He reached out and grabbed Lisa's arm, pulling her up from the bench. "You're coming with me." Lisa's eyes filled with tears, her body trembling in fear. "No, please," she cried, her voice breaking. "I didn't do anything wrong. My mom's inside." But Tom wasn't listening. He was already too deep into his assumption. His grip on her arm tightened, and Lisa's cries only grew louder as he began leading her toward his patrol car. People walking by started to slow down, their gazes drawn to the scene: a mother and child, a police officer, and handcuffs. "Mommy!" Lisa screamed as tears streamed down her cheeks. Just as Tom opened the door to his patrol car, ready to place Lisa in the back seat, the doors to the grocery store swung open with a loud bang. Edgar, her arms full of groceries, had just exited when she saw her daughter in handcuffs, tears running down her small face. Lisa Edgar's voice was filled with panic. She dropped her grocery bags, their contents spilling across the sidewalk as she rushed toward her daughter. "What is going on here?" Tom turned around, his expression stern and unyielding. I caught this girl stealing from the store. She's coming with me." Edgar's heart pounded in her chest as she knelt down beside Lisa, wiping the tears from her daughter's cheeks. "Baby, are you okay? What happened?" Lisa sniffled, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't do anything wrong, Mommy. I told him I was waiting for you, but he won't listen." Edgar stood up, fury flashing in her eyes as she turned to face Tom. "How dare you handcuff my daughter? She's 9 years old. She's innocent." Tom's face remained expressionless, his voice cold and professional. I was just doing my job." She was acting suspiciously. Suspiciously, Edgar's voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "She's a little girl eating a snack. How is that suspicious? By now a crowd had begun to form, whispers rippling through the onlookers. What's going on? A man asked, his phone raised to record the incident. Did that officer really handcuff a little girl? Another voice added. Tom, feeling the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, stood firm. Ma'am, I have to follow procedures. I saw suspicious activity, and I acted accordingly. Edgar stepped forward, her face inches from Tom's. Your procedures are wrong, she spat. You didn't even bother to ask her. You just assumed. This is my daughter we're talking about. Tom shifted uncomfortably. He had always prided himself on his judgment, but the crowd was turning on him. He could feel it, the tension, the disapproval, the murmurs of outrage. His gaze fell on Lisa, her small frame still shaking with sobs, and for the first time, doubt began to creep into his mind. Edgar's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. Take those handcuffs off my daughter. Now. Tom hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the key. The crowd watched in silence as he unlocked the handcuffs, releasing Lisa's small wrists. Edgar immediately scooped her daughter into her arms, cradling her protectively. You're okay, baby, Edgar whispered soothingly. Mommy's here. Tom took a step back, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. The crowd began to disperse, but not before a few more phones were raised to capture the moment. He could feel their judgment, the stares that lingered even after the people had moved on. For the first time in his career, Tom felt something unfamiliar, a nagging sense of guilt. Edgar wasn't finished. She set Lisa down gently and stood tall, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. I'm filing a formal complaint against you, officer. You need to be held accountable for this. Tom's face flushed, but he tried to remain composed. Ma'am, you have every right to file a complaint, but I stand by my actions. You think you can get away with this? Edgar snapped. You handcuffed my daughter, accused her of stealing without a shred of evidence, and now you're trying to brush it off like it's nothing. She pointed a finger at him, her voice rising. You think just because you wear a badge you can do whatever you want. Not with my daughter. The crowd had thinned, but a few stragglers remained, their eyes glued to the confrontation. One man in the back called out, Yeah, let him know. Another woman nodded in agreement, her phone still recording. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had followed the law, hadn't he? But as he looked at Edgar, her face red with anger, her arms wrapped protectively around Lisa, he felt the weight of his mistake pressing down on him like never before. For the first time, he wasn't so sure he was right. The incident at the grocery store rippled through the small community like a stone dropped into still water. News of Officer Tom's actions spread quickly, fueled by video clips taken by onlookers, showing the distraught face of 9-year-old Lisa, her tear-streaked cheeks and trembling hands in cuffs. The town, which had always prided itself on its tight-knit, harmonious atmosphere, was now buzzing with tension. Parents whispered about the dangers of sending their children out alone, and discussions about race and authority found their way into every conversation. Officer Tom, once the embodiment of law and order, now found himself at the center of a storm. At first, he clung tightly to his convictions, repeating to himself and anyone who would listen that he was simply following protocol. I did what any officer would do, he told his colleagues in the locker room, his voice firm though his heart began to feel otherwise. If you see something suspicious, you act. That's the job. But his colleagues didn't look at him the same way. Some, like Officer Mike, stood by him, patting him on the back and muttering, You did what you had to do, Tom. Don't let them make you feel bad for it. Others, however, like Officer Lily, couldn't hide their discomfort. She watched Tom with a quiet, thoughtful gaze, as though seeing a man she no longer recognized. The tension came to a head when Chief Simmons called Tom into his office. The chief, a seasoned officer with decades of service under his belt, had seen his fair share of tough situations, but this one felt different. He sat behind his desk, hands folded, as Tom entered the room. Take a seat, Tom, Chief Simmons said, his voice calm but heavy with unspoken weight. Tom sat, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. I won't beat around the bush, the chief continued. A formal complaint has been filed against you for racial profiling and the unjust arrest of a minor. There's an investigation underway, and until it's completed, you're suspended from duty." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. Suspended? Him? He opened his mouth to protest but found no words came. He had always been a man of the law, a man who believed in the system. How could this be happening? Chief Tom finally said, his voice shaking slightly. "I was just doing my job." She looked suspicious sitting alone, holding that snack, looking around nervously. "I was protecting the community." Chief Simmons sighed, rubbing his temples. "Tom, I get it. You acted on instinct. But this isn't just about one incident. The world is changing. People are more aware, more sensitive, and frankly, we need to be better at understanding the community we serve. You're going to have to face the possibility that you made a mistake." Tom felt his heart pound in his chest. A mistake? He wanted to argue, to shout that he had done nothing wrong. But there was something in the chief's voice, something in his eyes that gave Tom pause. "You'll have to attend mandatory sensitivity and bias training," the chief added, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We're trying to rebuild trust with the community, Tom. You're a good cop, but this is about more than just following the rules. It's about understanding the people we're supposed to protect." Tom left the office in a daze, the weight of the suspension hanging over him like a dark cloud. His badge, which once felt like a symbol of pride, now seemed to burn a hole in his chest. A week later, Tom found himself seated in a sterile, windowless room with a small group of other officers. The words bias and sensitivity training were written in bold letters on a screen at the front of the room. Officer Lilly sat a few seats down, glancing at him occasionally but saying nothing. The instructor, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, stood at the front of the room with a gentle but firm presence. "Today," she began, "we're going to talk about implicit bias, those unconscious thoughts and assumptions that we all carry with us." Tom folded his arms over his chest, his skepticism clear. He wasn't biased. He didn't treat people differently based on their race or background. He was fair, he was just, he simply enforced the law. But as Sarah continued, something in her words began to gnaw at him. "We all have biases," she said, "even if we don't realize it. They can influence how we see the world, how we interact with others, and yes, even how we police our communities." As the session wore on, Sarah presented scenarios, some of which felt uncomfortably familiar to Tom. She described situations where officers had made snap judgments based on a person's appearance where small, seemingly harmless assumptions had led to disastrous consequences. Tom felt a tight knot form in his stomach. Could that be what happened with Lisa? Had he assumed she was guilty because of the way she looked? The room was silent as Sarah played a video of a similar incident from another city, where a young boy had been wrongfully detained by police officers. Tom watched as the boy's mother cried out, much like Edgar had, her voice filled with the same righteous fury. His heart clenched as the boy's face, streaked with tears, reminded him so much of Lisa. Suddenly, Tom felt a wave of doubt crash over him. Was he wrong? Had his strict adherence to the law blinded him to the nuances of humanity? He sat back in his chair, feeling the ground beneath him shift in a way he hadn't expected. When the training session ended, Tom didn't rush out like the others. He stayed behind, staring at the empty screen, lost in thought. Lily, who had remained quiet throughout the session, walked up to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You okay, Tom?" she asked gently. Tom shook his head. The words stuck in his throat. I might have been wrong," he whispered, almost to himself. Lily nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. It's hard to face, but realizing that is the first step. As Tom left the training center that day, he felt a shift within him. The certainty that had once defined his life as a cop was now replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. For the first time, he began to see the gray areas he had always tried so hard to ignore. And with that realization came a deep sense of shame, because in his pursuit of law and order, he had forgotten to be human. Now, for the first time in his career, he was ready to change that. Officer Tom had always been known as a law-abiding, strict officer who never veered off the path of rules and regulations. He believed that his role as a cop was to maintain order, and that sometimes required making tough decisions, like what he did with Lisa. Arresting a 9-year-old girl for a supposed theft was just another necessary action in his day-to-day job, or so he thought. The gravity of what had happened still weighed heavily on his mind, especially now that he had been temporarily suspended due to accusations of racial profiling. Tom's time off gave him space to reflect on what had transpired that day at the grocery store. In the back of his mind, something kept tugging at him, a lingering sense of guilt, as if there was more to the situation than his judgment had accounted for. That feeling grew stronger after he found out about Helping Hands, the charity Lisa's family had founded. Edgar, Lisa's mother, was the head of the organization, and her family worked tirelessly to serve underprivileged communities, providing meals and support to struggling families. What shocked Tom even more was learning that Helping Hands had once helped his own family. Years ago, when his father lost his job and his mother was ill, Tom's family had relied on food donations from a local charity to get by. It was a difficult time for them, and they had been too proud to ask for help, but a kind stranger had delivered a box of food to their doorstep. It had been a lifeline. And now, to discover that the same organization, Helping Hands, was run by the very family he had wronged felt like a punch to the gut. The realization hit Tom harder than anything before. He had accused an innocent child, a child whose family had dedicated themselves to helping others, including his own. How could he have been so blind? The knowledge that his actions had hurt a family that had once been a beacon of hope for his own felt like the ultimate betrayal. For the first time, Tom was forced to confront the reality of his own biases and assumptions. Driven by a newfound sense of responsibility, Tom made the decision to reach out to Edgar and offer his help at Helping Hands. He wasn't sure if his presence would be welcomed, but he knew he had to try. It wasn't enough to simply reflect on his mistakes. He had to show, through actions, that he was willing to change. When Tom first arrived at the charity, he was greeted with silence and wary glances. Edgar and Paul were there, and the tension in the room was palpable. Edgar barely acknowledged him, her cold gaze a stark reminder of the damage he had caused. Paul, on the other hand, remained distant but not hostile. They didn't trust him, and Tom couldn't blame them. How could they, after what he had done to their daughter? Lily, a volunteer who had been with Helping Hands for years, was the only one who approached him. "You've got a lot of work to do if you're serious about this," she said, handing him an apron. "But if you're here to help, then help." Tom took the apron, feeling a mixture of shame and determination. He spent the next several days doing the most menial tasks, cleaning floors, sorting donations, and serving meals. He kept his head down, speaking only when necessary, and worked diligently to prove himself. Each day he returned, Edgar would glance at him with suspicion, but slowly, over time, her icy demeanor began to thaw. Despite the growing discomfort, Tom's resolve only strengthened. The more he saw the good that Helping Hands did, the more he realized how wrong his assumptions had been. This charity was not just a place that handed out meals, it was a lifeline for so many families. People from all walks of life came through its doors, and Tom began to understand the deep impact of poverty, hardship, and discrimination in a way he had never seen before. His time at Helping Hands became more than just an attempt to atone for his actions. It became a transformative experience. He learned about the struggles of the community, hearing stories of job loss, health crises, and systemic barriers that kept people from rising above their circumstances. These were the people he had vowed to protect. And yet, in his rigid enforcement of the law, he had alienated them. One afternoon, as Tom was stacking boxes, Paul walked over to him. "You've been showing up every day," Paul said, breaking the silence that had defined their relationship. "Why?" Tom hesitated before answering. "Because I owe you that much," he said quietly. "I hurt your family, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want to do whatever I can to help." Paul studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "We'll see," he said, before turning to leave. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the closest thing to acceptance Tom had received since arriving. As the weeks passed, Tom continued to show up, and slowly the atmosphere around him began to shift. Edgar still kept her distance, but Paul seemed to soften, occasionally offering a few words of acknowledgement. Lily, who had initially been skeptical, now chatted with Tom while they worked side by side, sharing stories about the families Helping Hands had helped over the years. The work was hard, but for the first time in a long while, Tom felt like he was truly serving his community. Each meal he handed out, each box he lifted, each story he heard chipped away at the rigid walls he had built around himself as a cop. He realized that protecting and serving wasn't about enforcing rules, it was about understanding the people he served and standing with them, not above them. One day, after a particularly busy shift, Edgar approached Tom. Her expression was still guarded, but there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes, something that resembled the faintest trace of respect. "You've been here every day," Edgar said, her voice even. "And I've seen you working hard. But it's going to take more than that for us to trust you." Tom nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know," he replied, "and I'm not asking for anything. I just want to help." Edgar studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll see how things go." It was a small step, but it was enough to give Tom hope. He knew that rebuilding trust would take time, but he was committed to seeing it through. As he continued to volunteer at Helping Hands, Tom not only sought redemption but also found a deeper connection to the community he had once seen through a narrow, biased lens. This journey had changed him, and though the road ahead was long, he was ready to walk it. After weeks of volunteering at Helping Hands, Tom finally decided it was time to confront the family he had wronged. The guilt had been gnawing at him, and he knew that while his actions had shown change, the words of an apology were still necessary. He had learned that the process of redemption didn't end with hard work alone. It needed closure, forgiveness, and acceptance. One chilly Saturday afternoon, after the last of the meals had been served, Tom mustered the courage to approach Edgar and Paul. They were sitting together, reviewing donation lists. Lisa was nearby, helping organize canned goods into neatly stacked rows. Tom stood awkwardly for a moment, clearing his throat to get their attention. Edgar looked up first, her eyes still carrying traces of suspicion. Paul followed, giving Tom a guarded nod. Lisa, sensing something serious was about to happen, stopped what she was doing and turned toward them, her wide, curious eyes landing on Tom. I'd like to speak with you all," Tom started, his voice shaky. "I owe you an apology, one that's long overdue." Edgar and Paul exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Tom felt his heart pounding in his chest, but he pressed on. "What I did to Lisa that day was wrong. I acted on assumptions, on biases I didn't even know I had. I hurt your family, and I can't begin to express how sorry I am for that." Lisa's eyes grew wide, and Edgar's face softened, but she said nothing. Tom turned to Lisa, bending slightly to meet her at eye level. "Lisa, you didn't deserve what I did to you. I thought I was doing my job, but I wasn't listening. I wasn't seeing you for who you really are, and for that, I'm deeply, deeply sorry." Lisa, who had been so strong in the weeks following the incident, now seemed vulnerable, her lower lip trembling slightly. Paul put a comforting hand on her shoulder, but he looked at Tom with something new in his eyes, perhaps the beginnings of understanding. "You don't have to forgive me," Tom continued. "But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm learning to be better, to be someone who serves the community, not someone who hurts it." There was a long silence. Edgar's eyes glistened, and Paul gave a deep sigh, his arms crossed but his face softening. The weight of the moment hung in the air like a thick fog. Finally, Lisa spoke, her voice small but steady. "You really mean it?" she asked, her eyes searching his for the truth. Tom nodded, tears welling up in his own eyes. "I do, Lisa, more than anything." Another long pause. Then, in a move that caught Tom entirely off guard, Lisa took a step forward and wrapped her small arms around his waist in a gentle hug. Tom froze, overwhelmed by the gesture, before slowly returning the hug, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and emotion. When she pulled away, she smiled softly at him. "I forgive you," she whispered. It was a simple phrase, but for Tom, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. He turned to Edgar and Paul, still unsure of what to expect. Edgar's face had softened completely now, and Paul gave him a slight nod. "We're not there yet," Edgar said quietly, "but this is a start." Tom nodded, grateful beyond words. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He knew he still had a long way to go, but this was the moment he had been hoping for, a chance to heal the wound he had caused. A few days later, Tom was summoned to the police station to meet with the chief. His suspension had been a constant reminder of his failure, but the work he had been doing with Helping Hands had helped him shift his focus. Now, though, it was time to face the consequences of his actions on a professional level. As he entered the chief's office, Tom's nerves were on edge. He hadn't been back to the station since the investigation had begun, and he wasn't sure what to expect. "Take a seat, Tom," the chief said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Tom sat down, his hands clenched together in his lap. The chief stared at him for a moment, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I've been hearing about the work you've been doing with Helping Hands," the chief began. "Edgar and Paul have even spoken to me about it. I have to say, I'm impressed. It seems you've been taking this time to reflect on your actions." Tom nodded. "I have, sir. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm trying to make it right." The chief studied him for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "The department's investigation into your conduct has been concluded. The charges of racial profiling are serious, Tom, and they don't just go away because of good intentions." Tom swallowed hard, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settling back onto his shoulders. "That being said," the chief continued, "we've also taken into account the steps you've taken since then. The volunteer work, the apology to Lisa and her family, it shows growth. It shows that you're willing to change, and because of that, I'm willing to give you a second chance." Tom's eyes widened in surprise. "You're reinstating me?" The chief nodded. "With conditions. You'll be back on active duty, but you'll also be required to continue your community work. And you'll attend regular sensitivity and bias training sessions. We need officers who are not only good at their jobs but who understand the people they're serving." Tom nodded eagerly, a sense of relief flooding through him. "I understand, sir. I won't let you down." The chief gave him a small, approving nod. "I believe you, Tom. But remember, this is just the beginning. You have a lot of work ahead of you." Tom left the office feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Being reinstated wasn't just about getting his job back, it was about the opportunity to do things differently. To truly serve the community, not just enforce the law. Over the next few weeks, Tom threw himself into his dual responsibilities, returning to his duties as a police officer while continuing his work with Helping Hands. His colleagues were curious about his change in attitude, and while some were skeptical, others began to see the value in his new approach. Tom's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't just Officer Tom anymore, he was part of the community he served, and that made all the difference. Several months had passed since Tom's reinstatement, and although he had returned to his duties as a police officer, his involvement with Helping Hands had become a significant part of his life. The once distant and formal officer now found himself immersed in the daily operations of the charity, helping to organize food drives and community outreach programs. Tom's transformation had not gone unnoticed both by his colleagues at the police department and by the local community. One day, while helping Edgar and Paul prepare meals for a homeless shelter, the idea for a larger event came up. Edgar, ever the visionary, suggested a community-wide event that would bridge the gap between the police force and the public. Tom, still navigating his new role in the community, saw this as an opportunity to show the town that things could change, that police officers could be allies, not adversaries. "I think it's a great idea," Tom said, looking at Edgar with determination. "A community event where we can work together, not just to help, but to understand one another." Edgar nodded thoughtfully. "It's time, Tom. People need to see that change is possible, that we can move past the hurt." Over the next few weeks, Helping Hands and the local police department worked together to organize the event. Tom, now a key figure in the planning process, reached out to his fellow officers, encouraging them to participate. Some were hesitant, still uncertain about the new Tom, but others, having seen the change in him firsthand, were eager to be part of something positive. On the day of the event, the town square was transformed. Booths were set up offering free meals, donated clothes, and information on various community programs. Police officers stood alongside volunteers from Helping Hands, working together to distribute food and talk with local residents. It was a sight few had ever expected. Officers and civilians, once divided by mistrust, now standing side by side, working toward a common goal. Tom, dressed in his uniform, but feeling more like a member of the community than an enforcer of the law, stood near the main stage, watching as Lisa, Edgar, and Paul helped set up for the day's activities. A sense of pride and purpose filled him. This was what it meant to truly serve the people. It wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about fostering trust, understanding, and unity. As the day progressed, speeches were given by both community leaders and police officers, but the highlight came when Lisa, now more confident and outspoken, was invited to the stage to share her story. She spoke about her experience, how she had once feared the police but had come to see that people could change. Her words were powerful, touching the hearts of everyone present, especially Tom. "I used to think all police officers were scary," Lisa said, her voice steady but emotional. "But Officer Tom showed me that people can change if they want to. He became my friend, and he helps me with my schoolwork now. He's not just a police officer anymore, he's part of our community." Applause erupted from the crowd, and Tom felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't expected to become such an important part of Lisa's life, but the bond they had formed was undeniable. When Lisa finished her speech, she ran off the stage and hugged Tom tightly. He hugged her back, his heart full. This was why he had become a police officer in the first place, to make a difference, to protect and serve, not just with authority, but with compassion. In the weeks following the event, Tom's relationship with Lisa deepened. He had become a regular visitor at the Helping Hands Center, not just to volunteer but to spend time with Lisa. He helped her with her homework, played games with her, and even attended some of her school events. The once cold and distant officer had become a trusted mentor and friend, not only to Lisa but to her entire family. Paul and Edgar, though initially skeptical of Tom's intentions, had come to trust him fully. They saw the sincerity in his actions, the genuine effort he was making to atone for his past mistakes. It wasn't just about making amends for what had happened in the grocery store, it was about building a new relationship, one based on trust, respect, and understanding. One evening, after a long day at the center, Tom and Lisa sat on the steps outside the building, watching the sunset. Lisa was quiet, her usual chatter replaced by a thoughtful silence. "What's on your mind, kiddo?" Tom asked, glancing down at her. Lisa shrugged. "I was just thinking about how things used to be. I used to be scared of you, you know." Tom smiled sadly. "I know, and I don't blame you for that. I made a lot of mistakes back then. But you're different now," Lisa said, looking up at him. You're like family." Tom's heart swelled at her words. Family. It was something he hadn't expected to find when he first started volunteering at Helping Hands, but somewhere along the way, that's exactly what they had become. Edgar, Paul, Lisa, they were his family now, in a way that went beyond blood. "I feel the same way," Tom admitted, ruffling her hair. "You and your family mean a lot to me, Lisa." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting the town in a warm, golden glow. Tom felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years, a peace that came from knowing he had made a real difference, not just in Lisa's life but in the lives of everyone in the community. Inclusion, the power of change and redemption. Tom's journey from a rigid, by-the-book police officer to a compassionate and community-focused individual was far from easy. It had been marked by mistakes, misunderstandings, and hard lessons. But through it all, Tom had learned that true service wasn't about enforcing laws, it was about understanding the people behind those laws. It was about seeing the humanity in everyone, no matter their background or circumstances. His relationship with Lisa and her family had taught him the power of forgiveness, of second chances, and of the ability to change. Tom had once believed that he was always right, that his way was the only way. But Lisa, with her innocent yet profound perspective, had shown him that there was so much more to being an officer than following the rules. In the end, Tom became more than just a police officer. He became a part of the community he served, a friend to those he once viewed with suspicion, and a mentor to a little girl who had once been afraid of him. His journey was one of redemption, proof that even those who have made mistakes can find their way back, can change for the better. As Tom continued his work with Helping Hands and the police department, he knew that there would always be challenges ahead. But he also knew that he had the support of his new family and his community. And that, more than anything, gave him the strength to keep moving forward, to keep building bridges instead of walls. In the end, the story of Officer Tom and Lisa was one of hope, a reminder that no matter how far we may stray from the path, there is always a way back. All it takes is a willingness to change, the courage to seek forgiveness, and the heart to serve with compassion.